Good morning from Toronto. This webinar is hosted by the Al Qasas Foundation for Education and Development. My name is Jiwan Chanik, and I was asked to talk a little bit about inclusivity and diversity in not-for-profits. I think where I would want to start is by thinking about um, what exactly is the goal and the role of not-for-profits. Many of us who, and I came from not-for-profits before I went to education, and I had a bit of a background in doing some international work as well as work in social services field. Um, I think if we start by thinking about who um, what the role of not-for-profits are. Often they have a niche in particular, trying to solve issues that impact marginalized populations. And when we talk about the issues that impact marginalized populations, one of the things that's really important for us to think about is how are we actually meeting the needs, and then how are we measuring the impact of our work. In a lot of sorry, in a lot of my experience, a lot of times we don't have a lot of boards that are very reflective of the populations that they serve. And when who is being served by not-for-profits, it's important that we think about who, who our majority populations are by way of numbers, and who our minority populations are by way of numbers. And then thinking about service delivery and what service delivery can look like in a way that serves the most marginalized folks that we serve. That inherently is what we would call an anti-oppressive stance to the work that we do. And the reason why we would want to engage an anti-oppressive stance is simply because when we start with the populations that we're serving who are the most marginalized, then we're able to serve everyone well. It acknowledges that in systems and structures that we operate in, that there are issues that are pretty complex, and that systems and structures generally perpetuate particular types of outcomes because they were created with specific kinds of realities in place. And so what that means is that inherently systems and structures are not fair, nor are they always objective or neutral. What that should mean for us in the scope of our work in not-for-profits is that we need to start to think about how it is that we are best serving our clientele. Let's say, for example, you have issues with the fact that I said that organizations and not neutral or objective or fair. Um, Here's how I would counter that. If you think about the laws as they were created in a post-colonial world, in a world where colonization was the reality, a lot of the rules were created within those colonial structures. Those colonial structures and laws, as they were created inherently with the belief, for example, that indigenous people needed to be civilized, and that Black people were created or were to be used as economic resources for those who were in power. That was the reality. And a lot around the world reflect that. Though we've moved somewhat with some of the laws, the majority of laws in the world remain the same. And so they lead to the same types of outcomes. Not-for-profits, by their very nature, follow particular rules and guidelines. And what that means is that they're created within constructs that perpetuate the same types of outcomes. So in Ontario, for example, we see that most of the kids who are being taken up by child welfare, for example, we see and indigenous people in jails. There's all kinds of statistics that prove this. So this is now out of the realm of, maybe we can think about this, maybe we may not. There's evidence, there's more to do is to be able to think and talk about the fact that as not-for-profits, we exist within the scope and the realm of laws that perpetuate that. The same laws that, in Canada, for example, only 100 years ago, we were still talking about um, whether or not women could vote, whether or not they were equal, all of those types of things. Now we see a reality that shows that, for example, women are making less than men for the same jobs. And in the last couple of years have slid back, not even gained momentum in terms of earning the same wage. So, sorry, I'm just getting over a cold. But so then the reality needs to be, okay, so we exist within those types of structures and frameworks. How do we then orient ourselves as an organization or organizations that actively look for ways to ensure that we're not perpetuating inequities? And the other thing that then means is that the role of equity and anti-oppressive leadership is not something that is inherently within people's nature, within people's grasp. It doesn't mean that because you're a nice person that automatically you become equitable. Um, and so that is a reality that we have to keep in mind. Equity and anti-oppressive work needs to be looked at as leadership competencies. So when you're building the boards for not-for-profit, some of the things that you need to think about is, how does your board best reflect the people that you serve, not just those who are a majority in terms of numbers, but those who are in the minority, as well as voices of people who you may not serve, but who may be well placed to give advice or feedback in a way that will help us. That's one. The other thing is, what is the skill set of the people in terms of being able to understand equity and anti-oppressive work in order to think about how they solve the issues. So, because an anti-oppressive stance comes with several principles. And those principles help leaders and organizations problematize the way they do work in order to get to excellent service. And so I think one of the things to think about is that equity is not just a nice thing to do if and when you have time, but equity and anti-oppressive leadership actually is trying to help people understand that when we engage in leadership this way, we're going to get to service excellence, we're going to get to a better way of serving our clientele. And when we begin by thinking about those who are most marginalized, we're able to support them and everyone else because we're gearing the work that we're doing. So when you think about how we look at the diversity in the organization, the first thing that I'm going to say that we have to look at is look at who you've hired. One thing that we do not talk about that is empowering people just identity. We're talking about hiring people with good skill sets, but when we understand that their social identities bring with it particular types of assets or gifts, and brings with it insights that people who have not shared those experiences will have. That allows for your organization to be more creative. That allows for them to be more innovative, which actually helps to move forward. And that's not something that I need to get into because we understand the role of innovation and creativity. The best teams are not the teams that all look the same and sound the same, but they're actually teams that share the same vision, but how they come at it may be different. So you need to look at things like race. You need to, for example, for an organization that serves refugees, but your board doesn't have anybody who was a refugee, I would say that's a problem. And not that one refugee can speak for all refugee experiences, because we know that's not the case. The same thing around thinking about that. Who are of the staff and the people? What are their experiences in the context of who we serve? Because if we don't understand cultural realities and realities that are nuanced based on diversity, our service delivery methods become skewed and they become problematic. The way we try to solve problems can actually be harming populations instead of helping them. That in turn will not allow us to achieve our objective, right? So when we think about how we assess it, we have to talk about social identity. And if it is that the organization is overly abundant with particular types of one type of identity, if for example you look across the room and people look the same, that's a problem. It doesn't mean that those people aren't skilled. It doesn't mean that those people don't have good things to bring to the table, but it means that you're missing out on other vital things that are important and that are significant for us to be able to actually get to meeting the needs of our clientele. The other thing that's also really important for us to think about is that as we start trying to engage that, what we need to think about what that might bring. Often people will say that when organizations start to diversify that way, it presents a bunch of challenges. It's true. There are challenges that will come up. And I would argue that when you engage in hiring, you hire with people who share the same vision, but may not share the same way. Those critical conversations, those challenges that come up, are necessary conversations, because while it may be harder for the organization initially, you develop a set of working principles that start with: how do we put the needs of the most marginalized first? How do we make sure that the people who have the biggest similarities in the organizations don't overtake the decision-making processes? It's not always about numbers. How do we articulate who has power and position, both in the organization and society? And how do we make sure that voices that are traditionally marginalized in communities are actually heard? And so that we begin orienting ourselves by prioritizing voices that often are silenced. That is challenging in the beginning. There is no way to get through those types of challenges. But what you get for it in return by the time you work through a solution is you get a higher yield for what it is you're trying to get to. One of the things that we have to remember is that coherence and consistency in organizations, and in larger organizations, this is a challenge, is not the antithesis to creativity and innovation. You can be coherent in the set of principles that you use, but have creativity and innovation in ways that will support the organization to get to their best outcome. So that's a pretty significant thing for us to keep in mind. Now, one of the challenges with technology is I didn't pay attention to my battery, so I just need to grab my plug to make sure that this webinar doesn't cut off right away. So just give me 1 second. Sorry about that. So I think the something that we have to keep in mind is how do we engage in these processes in ways that are going to help us, so that that we are able to be successful in what it is we're trying to gain. Another part of the problem is often the goals articulated by organizations or not-for-profits didn't actually start through a consultative process or a collaborative process with the people who are in most need or who have been most harmed. And so they come, many people often, especially in any type of not-for-profit, social work, all humanitarian work, sometimes we may come to things with this mentality of we're going to fix it or we are going to save people. that ends up leading us down paths where we're creating solutions for things that people who are harmed, they don't actually want, nor do they need. And if that is the case, and then the problem becomes, how do we then engage in a way of thinking about what it is we're doing? Because we might be setting goals and measuring outcomes based on things that we think are important, but they're not actually important. So a while ago, when I would do a course for people at a college where they would do some overseas service provision, a big part of what I tried to do was to be able to help them understand that when we go into communities, especially as people who are a lot of trying to frame responses based on what they say their needs are, not based on what we think the needs are. And that missionary type of approach has done a lot of damage. If you look at what happened with the Green Revolution that was taken to part continent, it actually led to the deaths of imposition of what the solution was supposed to be like. In the case of what happened in India, deaths by the thousands. In some parts of Africa, it destroyed whole communities because of the solutions that were created by people to be able to try and help us solve what those issues were. Um, when it comes to dealing with the issues of diversity and equity, there are a lot of challenges that comes with it. Often people who have privilege, and we all have different kinds of privilege, often begin to feel defensive. Sometimes they feel guilty. Sometimes they feel restricted, as if they're being blamed for the privileges they have. Here's the thing about privilege. Privilege does not mean that you got everything easy in life. Privilege doesn't mean that you didn't have to struggle for what you have or what you need. But what it means is that there are things that, based on who we are, our social identities, that we get benefits for no reason other than having them. For example, as a man who identifies as a man with, I have male privilege. My male privilege does not mean I'm a bad person. Recognizing, though, that the way I navigate the world is not the same way that women have to navigate the world, and that many of the things that I have to think about that that I will never have to think about, women will always have to think about it. So I have to be mindful of my male privilege. Take that and think about not-for-profits. When you think about who's on boards and how they construct what the solutions are, the absence of women from the solution making pieces of it then becomes a problem. Same thing with my able-bodied privilege. I have able-bodied privilege, and oftentimes I will not experience what people with disabilities have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. Um, those things don't make me bad, but I have to recognize that I have them. And in knowing that I have them, I have to know that when I'm trying to come to solutions, there are things that I will inherently miss. And so it's not about always having the right solutions, but it's about knowing which questions to ask, understanding how my identity plays a role in how I form this, and then thinking about what it is I need to do and who do I need to consult in order to come to a better end result with this. Um, and so often when we talk about it, even in terms of the many different layers, class, for example, is another a privilege. Me myself, at one point in my life, I was homeless for a short period. That doesn't, and now I'm not. So I have understandings and experiences that other people will not have. Sometimes people keep those things with them, sometimes they forget. the reality is these are the real things that we have to think about. What are the experiences of the people that we have around us? What are the different experiences based on, for example, my race, my religion, all those different things? There are ways that I have to navigate the world that other people will not. And it's the same thing in recognizing, for example, anti-Indigenous, anti-Black racism is real, homophobia, transphobia is real. All of these things are real things. The goal when we address these challenges is not about deciding whether or not we agree with them. It's to recognize that there's copious amounts of evidence that tell us that they do exist. And if they do exist, then the next question needs to be, how is it that we're going to work within our organizations to make sure that we're not perpetuating structural barriers that often impacts people? And if we think about that, then what we have to keep asking ourselves is the intent of the goals and the work that we're doing matching the impact of the goals and the work that we're doing? That's going to be significant. So intent versus impact is really, really important. Um, uh, and I think that, we have to think about our intent and impact based on the goals that we have created, thinking about who created them and whether or not they are connected to the people that we're serving. So within the context of Canada, there is the legislation that we have here that is significant for us is our in Ontario, for example, the Ontario Human Rights Code. In the country of Canada, our Charter of Rights and Freedom. And I think that if we think about that, the reason why the code and the charter exist, they exist above and beyond the law and the statutes as they are, because it recognizes the fact that the law is not neutral. And because we know that the law is not neutral, we need to be able to think about how we do this in the best way. So basically what I was saying, that there are real challenges when it comes to doing the work, and a lot of it has to deal with the privilege that some people enjoy and feeling at times attacked because they have those privileges. Based on the examples that I was sharing about my own self, I think what's significant for us to remember is that your privilege doesn't make you a bad person, but recognizing that you have privilege and there's ways that you experience the world. And it is possible for people to have privilege and have areas of oppression that they struggle with in the real world. So for example, with me, I talked about my male privilege. I talked about my able-bodied privilege. But I also experience oppression based on my race, based on my religion. All of those things are things that are a reality for many, many people. When we think about our organizations, in particular about diversity, it's not enough to just have bodies that look different than ours or people who are different from us, but it is significant and important for us to think about what are the experiences and how do we support the people that we bring in who may have different lived experiences so that they can be successful within the organization, knowing that a lot of times systems and structures do not support people who don't fit a particular type of mold. Remember, like what I was saying in the beginning, a lot of colonial laws were constructed in ways that makes Indigenous people, makes Black people, makes people of color, marginalized people be the other. And then there's a standard by which everyone is judged. That standard is often skewed by the people who created those standards to begin with. So when I talk to CEOs, for example, and they talk to me about their best hire, I talk to them about, well, best hire for whom? when I would do hiring, often I would hire people who would share my vision, but not necessarily the path. And I would mentor those folks and try to push them so that they would be comfortable challenging me and knowing that their jobs are not in jeopardy if they're challenging me. And then once we get to some kind of consensus, then we work together towards whatever that consensus is. And I think that those are the things, the ways that we need to do. If we know that the laws and structures have been created in ways that allow some people to be more successful, then a part of what the organization needs to do is to actually give people whose voices have been marginalized, silenced, people who are selectively unheard, more space to be able to speak. And not just speak, the people who have power need to help the other people in the organization understand that they have to listen to those voices. So you see it, for example, with organizations that want to go in and support indigenous communities, but they haven't consulted with elders. They have not consulted with the communities that they want to go in to serve. They might have one person whose views might mirror their own, but it wasn't something where it was based on relationships, where it was active listening to communities, where the solutions were co-created. And so then the organization can have goals. Well, we will do X, Y, and Z. They go into communities, they do it, and then it causes damage. So I'll give you an example. When I was a teacher, I took a group of students to another country. Most of the students were privileged, coming from privileged backgrounds, and we were going into an impoverished community in terms of socioeconomic status, not in terms of life experiences and the other amazing things that we learned from them, but in terms of socioeconomic status. We were going into a community like that, and it was really important for me to spend a couple months with those students ahead of time, helping them understand that, one, we were not going into the community to fix it or to save people. Another thing that I did not let them do, I didn't let them take suitcases of clothes and shoes to give to the community folks who were there, for the simple reason that we didn't have enough to give to everyone. You go in and you give some and you don't give to others. What you end up doing is you fracture the community, you develop have and have nots, and then you feel good about yourself, but you end up doing damage to that community. And so it's important when we develop solutions that they're grounded in the realities of communities, that we're not going in with this idea that we know better, that we're going to fix and save. I mean, if you think about the state of the world today, where we are with things like global warming, where we are with things with environmental destruction and disaster, the greatest learning we can gain now would be from indigenous nations. And because they have lived in sync with nature for tens of thousands of years. We have not privileged that knowledge. We have not privileged that as expertise. We often look at expertise in particular ways. The same thing about when we talk about medicine. We privilege allopathic medicine, Western medicine, which is about 150 years old. And I'm not saying, don't hear me say that allopathic medicine is bad, but there are other forms of medicine that have existed for thousands of years that we dismiss now as being alternative, when the reality is the youngest form of medicine is really allopathic medicine, or one of the youngest forms of medicine. And so we tend to go into spaces with a colonial mindset, with a construct of what is best and what is good, and we impose that on whole groups of people based on our understanding, and that understanding does a lot of damage and destruction. When you hire people who are significantly different than yourself, but they share the goals that your organization has, then what that's going to do is to be able to support your organization to work in a good way with those communities, to rise to service excellence, to be able to serve your clientele in a way that is culturally responsive and relevant, in ways that are significant, and in ways that's going to help your organization to be successful. And that's the most important thing. I've seen it in a lot of community organization. The boards are most often, for example, male heavy. If they're not just male heavy, they're from a particular demographic, particular class. They don't want to hear from people who are different than them. They dismiss their voices. The structures they create reflect what they think is important, and they end up missing out whole groups of people. And then what ends up happening is we disaffect entire groups of people who do not want to engage with our organizations. And then when they express that as frustration, and when they express anger, then we get upset because we think that they're not willing to play nicely with us. And that always sets up a them and us dynamic. That them and us dynamic is actually something that is significant to leading to harm within organizations. So I think overall, if I was to say, anything else, I would say look at the diversity in your organizations, assess who's on your boards, who are your staff, who's the populations that you're servicing. How does your staff reflect the diversity of who you serve, up to and including your most marginalized people that you serve? How do they reflect those realities? How do you determine? You need to think about how you determine what your goals are. Have they been co-created with the most marginalized communities that you serve, and in collaboration? And then how do you measure? So the measurement has to look at whether or not your intent matches your impact. The other thing that we have to remember is that structures and that our structures and systems, they drive behavior, they drive our processes, they drive our policies. Our policies on their own are a type of system and structure. They drive our behavior, but they also reflect values and attitudes. And we have to think about whether or not what we're saying in our organization is that our values and attitudes in terms of how rules and policies were created are the best, who decided they were the best, by whom, for whom, and how do we actually think about our structures in ways that they're constantly transforming to best serve our clients. That's the thing that we want to think about. The other thing that I would say is we have to talk about social identity. We have to think about who is in the space, and we have to look at varying social identities. I mentioned some of them: race, class, gender, sexual orientation, immigration status, language status, education levels, indigenous identities. All of these things are significant, and you have to be active as an organization in seeking out those voices and making sure they are present. That means that sometimes getting to decisions will be challenging. But if you're the ones leading the organization, the challenges that you're getting there is going to get you to a better place. So what that means is that ideas around coherence and consistency in your organization does not have to be oppositional to creativity and to innovation. We have to think about them as two hands together, as supporting each other. That's the way that we are going to get better at serving people well. And ultimately, to remember that, none of us are equitable by nature. I've been doing this work for 20 years. I would not say that I'm equitable. I would always say that I continue to learn about equity, because ultimately it's about how do we ensure service excellence to every individual person. And so what that means is that I'm constantly learning. What it means is that I need to not know all the solutions, but I need to know the questions to ask. I need to think about what are the privileges that I have that would not allow me to be aware of some of the realities of other groups of people, not to make my reality the de facto or default thing that I resort to as being the standard best thing. And instead recognize equity and an anti-oppressive stance as a leadership competency. Just like we recognize other leadership skills that leaders need to have, we need to recognize that this is a leadership skill. And if it's one thing that I would say that this is something that we often miss in our organizations. I would also say that Sending people to an equity workshop is not enough. It does not support a healthy organization. It does help with baseline learning, but the other things that it does is that it helps. What we want to do is explicitly embed the equity pieces. We want to explicitly embed that in the work that we do so that equity is not siloed to the side, but it's seen as the way that we do our work to get towards our goals and measures. So how is this being done equitably? Those are some general principles that I think in many sectors, I wouldn't just say not-for-profits, but in many sectors, that's where we want to be able to be focused on, especially when we understand that the work that our organizations do, they play an important role, a significant role in supporting communities and supporting individuals, sometimes people in really dire situations, being able to help them get to the best place that they can get to be able to do better. So on that note, I'm just going to end here. I'm going to thank you. I apologize once again for the technical difficulty in the middle, and hopefully this was valuable. Thank you.